Hello, my dear students. I'm CA A.Rafeq. I'm delighted to welcome you to this presentation on Chapter 1, Concepts of Governance and Management of Information Systems. This part 4 of a series of 5 presentations. In this presentation, we'll be discussing and understanding what is COBIT 5, how it is a business framework, and you can use COBIT 5 as a governance and management framework for implementing GEIT, which is Governance of Enterprise Information Technology. We'll also be discussing about IT compliance reviews. If you want to understand governance, I think COBIT is one framework we need to understand. This is part 4 of the series of 5 presentations. If you've not viewed the earlier presentations, I suggest you please review these presentations which are done earlier, because these are given in a logical flow. So if you've already gone through the introduction, part 1, 2, and 3, then you come to part 4, you find it will be much more easier for you to understand the topic. In this presentation, as I said, we'll be discussing COBIT 5, which is actually the business framework for enterprise information technology, and we'll also be discussing what is an IT compliance review. COBIT is a framework which can be used for implementing information technology. Now, if you remember earlier we had discussed, for implementing effectively any information technology, there are 3 pillars, and these are called as people, process, and technology. You can buy technology and you can deploy this technology as required, but you need to have proper processes in place to be able to effectively use this technology. And these processes need to be formulated, and these need to be formalized, and these to be implemented as required. The people have to run the processes in the technology, and that's why you need to train the people. For ensuring that you have the best practices, you need to adopt frameworks which are globally accepted. And COBIT is one such framework which can be used for implementing best practices across enterprises. And in fact, COBIT stands for Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology. We'll also be discussing about how IT compliance review is done and how COBIT could be used for IT compliance review. COBIT is a framework which can be used not only for compliance, it can be used as a GRC framework. It can be used for multiple purposes. Let's go further. Why is COBIT called a business framework? COBIT is called as a business framework because it can be used across enterprises regardless of the nature of the business, regardless of the size of the enterprise, regardless of the type of the business. And it is business oriented. What is given in COBIT in simple terms is called as codified common sense. So these are best practices which are adopted by global enterprises, and this can be used for any enterprise. What you need to know is to pick what is relevant and customize. So when you're using COBIT, you need to pick what is relevant for you. COBIT, as I said, is more like a 5-star buffet. You should know what to pick, and you need to customize and implement as required. So why do enterprises need to use COBIT? Considering the fact that IT is an integral part of any enterprise, now you find that when you use best practice like COBIT, you are able to bring in governance, and you're also able to bring in enterprise risk management, and you can bring in and implement controls as required. You can integrate COBIT with various other frameworks. There are various components of COBIT. So we'll look at what are the different components of COBIT. When you are implementing a best practice framework, it requires investment people, it requires investment process and technology. You need to change the way you're doing things to be able to do in a better way. And that are some of the benefits which are given by COBIT. We'll see what are the key benefits which can accrue to enterprise by using COBIT. You need to customize COBIT as per the requirement. This is the most important thing. You need to select and customize as required. So we'll quickly go through how you can customize COBIT as per your requirement. There are 5 principles of COBIT, which are the building blocks of how COBIT is actually framed. And there are also the COBIT process reference model. COBIT presents the information in a structured way. So you need to know what is the model, how this COBIT information presents this way. So if you know how COBIT is structured and presented, then you find understanding COBIT, implementing COBIT becomes much more easier. There are also 7 enablers of COBIT, which are the building blocks of COBIT. And when you want to implement COBIT, you need to know what is the underlying thinking, the philosophy. And this is given by the 7 enablers. You can also do risk management in COBIT. In earlier part 3, we talked about risk management. Here we'll discuss quickly how you can do risk management using COBIT 5. You can do multiple things using COBIT 5. In fact, you want to learn COBIT 5, there is a 1-week course. But what I would like to give from your examination perspective and from a practical perspective is the essence of how COBIT could be used. COBIT can be used as the best practice framework for GRC. GRC, as you know, is governance, risk, and compliance. So we will understand how COBIT practices, governance practices, risk management practices, and compliance practices you can pick from COBIT and adopt as required. In IT compliance review, there are 3 aspects we'll be covering. What are the compliance which is given in COBIT? We'll also look at the key management practices which are implemented in COBIT. Through COBIT, using COBIT, we'll also talk about the key metrics for assessing a compliance. Compliance is most critical for organization, and if you remember in chapter 1, we talked about 2 dimensions of governance, and these 2 dimensions of governance are the conformance dimension and the performance dimension. Management wants to achieve business objectives, and that is the performance dimension. But while achieving the goals, it's also important that the organization complies with all the legal and regulatory requirements, and that is the conformance dimension. And many of the organizations you would have seen, when the compliance is not in place, the organization gets into major loss or has to go out of business. Now let's understand what is COBIT. COBIT is a GEIT framework. Now part 1 of the presentation you've seen, GEIT deals with 2 aspects, GE and IT. You can also further break into GE and then IT, which means you're talking about governance, we're talking about enterprises and information technology, which means fundamentally we're looking at information technology, which has to be governed, and this is applicable across enterprises. You would also see in part 1 of the presentation the different aspects of governance. You can look at governance from a generic perspective. You can look at governance as applied to corporate level, which is corporate governance, or you can look at enterprises in general, or you can look at from a GIT perspective. The GIT is the latest concept pertaining to governance, because we're talking about enterprises using information technology as a key enabler for the purpose of doing the business. The fundamental premise in which COBIT starts is information is the currency of the information technology age, or the digital age. And now in GEIT, we're talking about information technology, and we are talking about the eye of technology. Now this information is the key for the success and survival of any enterprise. Now if you look at most of the modern enterprises which are doing e-commerce, you find the data which is available in a physical format now has become digitized. Now an e-commerce store which is selling millions of goods, for example Amazon sales, they got 6 crore inventory. It's not that they got one place go down where they got all the 6 crore inventory. What they've actually done is the physical store, the physical stock which is available with millions of suppliers across the country, across the world, they have digitized and made it available through an information system. And this is why we call it the digital age. So when you use information, when you have to provide access to information, the value of information is in providing access to the users as and when required. So you need to adopt the best practices so that you can use the information as required and make it available. You also need to secure the information, because security and availability both have to be balanced. So when you use frameworks like COBIT, you find COBIT provides you the best practices which can be used as a benchmark for the purpose of reviewing what you've done. So it means you can compare yourself with what you've done, identify what are the control weaknesses or gap areas, and keep improving. And it also helps you in implementing governance and management of enterprise IT. So you find when you use a framework like COBIT, you can actually ensure that you have implemented corporate governance and ERM as which is the regulatory requirement. So COBIT provides you the best practices which can help enterprises to create optimal value from IT. If you remember, we also talked about the business value. You need to balance the risk versus return. You look at any enterprise worth the name, you find a major portion of the investment in information technology. So you look at the balance sheet, you'll have the major investment in IT. And if you look at the profit and loss account, you'll have the major expenditure in IT. Which means for any enterprise worth the name, you find these are 2 significant aspects which are there, which impact both the financial statement, in terms of the balance sheet, in terms of the assets, also in terms of the expenditure. So when there is such a major investment and expenditure, it becomes a material item, you need to ensure that you're able to derive optimal value from information technology. By using frameworks like COBIT, you are able to adopt the best practices, which means you're able to realize the benefits and ensure the risks are actually optimized. You also ensure the resources which are used within the organization are deployed effectively, efficiently, and economically to derive optimal value. So when you use COBIT, you are able to bring in a system of governance. You are able to manage from a holistic perspective. When you look at the principles of COBIT, this will become much more clearer. And another important aspect is you adopt this across the enterprise, which means using the COBIT best practices, you can standardize the processes, procedures, etc. across the enterprise. Another important aspect of using COBIT, it helps you to manage the IT related risk, and you can ensure compliance, you can ensure business continuity, you can ensure security, and you can also ensure the privacy regulations are met. Now, these are some of the key benefits or need for enterprises to implement COBIT. Now, let's get into, I hope now you're clear that COBIT could be used as a framework for implementing GEIT. Quite often you find these terminologies, IT governance and GEIT are used, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. But you need to understand the context. IT governance is a term which was used earlier, and now the term which is used latest is GEIT. So GT is much more macro in nature compared to IT governance. But quite often these are also used interchangeably. So please don't get confused. The focus was IT governance was used earlier, where IT was used more from the point of data processing. But now, considering that IT has become integral to the organizations, the better concept to use is GEIT, Governance of Enterprise Information Technology. Now let's understand what is the interrelationship or what are the benefits of implementing GEIT in an organization. In the earlier slide, we have seen COBIT could be used as a framework for implementing IT governance, which means you can use it for implementing GEIT. Now here we are talking about IT governance. So let me elaborate that GEIT and ITG, these are interrelated concepts. So you use these terms IT governance and governance of enterprise information technology interchangeably, but you need to be clear that governance enterprise IT is much more broader, whereas IT governance is focused on information technology only. Any enterprise which is started, you find they have certain business objectives to be achieved, and their objective is to get value. So value delivery is one of the important aspects of governance. So when you want to achieve value delivery, you would have seen in the governance chapter also, we are discussing that there has to be strategic alignment. So if you see the part 2 of the presentation, we talked about IT strategic planning. IT strategic planning, the basic objective is to ensure that the business strategy has to be prepared and the IT strategy has to be in tune with the business strategy. You also need to have a system of risk management, which was covered in the earlier presentation. By using COBIT, you'll be able to do risk management. And you need to ensure that resources are managed effectively and efficiently, so you make optimal use of the resources. So COBIT also provides you, or IT governance also provides you a mechanism and means and methods for implementing this resource management. And all this best practices which you have in the organization, you'll not be able to implement unless you have proper performance measurement system in place. And this is what is provided by COBIT or in GEIT or in IT governance. So we have to summarize the discussion we have. So you need to have strategic alignment, and this is the fundamental objective of implementing governance. And you need to have risk management, which means you should be able to bring the risk to an acceptable level, and they need to ensure that value is delivered by using the resources optimally. And you will know whether you are on the right path or whether you're achieving the goals by having a performance measurement system in place, so that you can take appropriate remedial action as required. This is the crux of the governance, the focus areas when you implement IT governance. Now let's understand from a macro perspective, what is the organizational view of governance? Now, if you look at the stakeholders who have started that enterprise, whether it's they appoint an organization structure, they put in an organization structure in place where you have the CEO and then you have the CFO, CMO, etc., who will be reporting the CEO. Again, you have these various types of operations which would be there. Now let's get the distinction here in terms of what is IT governance and what is management. Now I think this graph clearly demonstrates to you that the top management, the board of directors, is what they do is actually called as IT governance, and what is done by the management is at the operational level. So it means the IT governance provides the strategy or the focus based on which the management is actually implemented or operationalized. Let's look at the stakeholder value. Who are the stakeholders? What do they achieve? What do they want to achieve? By using best practice framework like COBIT, you will ensure that you're able to get stakeholder value. And when you want to have stakeholder value, you need to have a system of governance and management in place. And especially for the information technology assets, which we know are very critical for the very survival and success of enterprises. The enterprises, boards, and the executive management have to embrace IT like any other significant part of the business. Gone are the days when IT was considered more for data processing. Now IT has become integral. In fact, IT is the building block based on which the businesses run. Similarly, you also have regulatory and contractual compliance requirements which make it mandatory for the enterprise to have governance system in place, else you have threats which can arise which can impact the value. And you also find that COBIT provides you a comprehensive framework. How it is comprehensive, what are the principles, what are the enablers, what are the dimensions of COBIT, we'll discuss this a little later. Okay. It provides a comprehensive framework that assists enterprises to achieve their goals and deliver value through effective governance and management of enterprise IT. Now, when you read this, you should also know that these are also the benefits of COBIT 5. Let's look at governance. Where is it given in COBIT 5? There is a separate area called governance and management. You also have the governance domain or the area which has specific processes within each of the governance areas. So you have this evaluate, direct, and monitor, which is a domain, and then you have the 5 processes which are specifically give you more content. So when an enterprise wants to implement governance, they first need to start with implementing a governance framework, have a setting and maintain this governance framework, ensure they have processes which ensure benefit delivery, have a mechanism and measures for implementing risk optimization, have a measures and methods and mechanism for resource optimization, and also have processes which ensure stakeholder transparency. You also have 4 management domains which are built on the principles of build, run, and monitor, which is also called as PBRM. So COBIT is all about governance, and under that you have PBRM, which is plan, build, run, and monitor. The governance domain has got 5 processes. The PBRM totally has got about 33 processes. Totally there are 38 processes. Don't worry, you don't need to remember each of those processes because you're supposed to understand COBIT from a macro level perspective. Now we are getting into the key benefits of implementing IT governance. Why an organization has to use COBIT? Now you find one of the key benefits, we talked about governance also, you're able to establish accountability. You're able to establish the decision rights, clearly communicating the roles and authority. In any modern enterprise, you find where information technology has integrated or embedded or inbuilt internal controls, it's important that you should know who can have access to what information. For example, if you look at an e-commerce store, the category manager for certain purchases. Now, if that person is able to change the purchases beyond the level of his authority, you can just know what will be the impact. Similarly, the sales managers who are in charge of deciding the prices, and most of the e-commerce pricing, you know, is dynamic in nature. When he's able to change the prices dynamically, there has to be certain limits in terms of what the authority level through which he can do. So that has to be clearly documented and defined and communicated. When you use COBIT framework, it provides you a mechanism that you need to have these type of systems and processes in place. You can manage the risks, the changes, and the contingencies proactively. You should also be able to improve the IT organizational performance, how IT is actually able to deliver value. You can also ensure compliances. We'll be discussing this compliance aspects a little more detail in the end of the presentation, and also about maturity in staff development. And ultimately, an organization survives by providing the right type of customer service. You can ensure there is a higher level of customer satisfaction, and the overall responsiveness to the customer for providing the services is enhanced drastically. There are some more benefits. If you look at the keyword here, aligns the IT investments and priorities in tune with the needs of the business. So when you are making investment in IT, it's in tune with the needs of the business. You are also able to manage, evaluate, prioritize, fund, measure, and monitor the request for various types of IT services. Many organizations require IT services to be delivered. If that is the case, you need to ensure that these are properly prioritized, and you also ensure that this investment in IT provides the resulting work and the deliverables. And this has to be done in a consistent and structured and repeatable manner. So when you invest in an application software deployment, or let's say in an ERP deployment, you know that you are able to get the result consistently across the enterprise. You're able to manage the utilization of resources by having specific structured approach. You can also ensure that IT delivers or as per the plans, budgets, and the commitments. How is COBIT able to do all this? Because it provides you the best practices for all the key areas which can be adopted by any organization, which is applicable across all type of enterprises and across all types of businesses. What are the business benefits to the enterprise by using COBIT? As we know, there is increased value creation for the use of IT. There is user satisfaction. Reduce the IT-related risks. You can develop more business-focused IT solution and services, because the first thing we do when you when you are engaging with the IT business is to identify what are the business needs, and you channelize the IT investment to provide services as per the needs of the business. And you are able to ensure there's increased enterprise-wide involvement in IT-related activities. IT department should not be working in isolation in their ivory towers. They should be working as per the needs of the enterprise. Now, this is another important concept. When you use frameworks like COBIT, although COBIT is said to be an umbrella framework which can operate at a macro level, which can be used across the enterprise, you also need to ensure that this is integrated with various other frameworks. Now, these are the different domains of COBIT, the 5 domains. You have the governance domain, which is evaluate, direct, and monitor. You have the 4 management domains, which are built on the principles of PB, R, and M, which is plan, and that is covered as align, plan, and organize. Build, which is build, acquire, and implement solution. Run, which is deliver, service, and support. And you have monitor, evaluate, and assess. Now, these are used by the acronym APO, which is align, plan, organize, EDM, which is evaluate, direct, and monitor. We have build, acquire, and implement, and deliver, service, and support. Now, you don't need to worry about remembering these acronyms. What is important is get the thought process and see how this applies. Most of the questions around COBIT would be around the various concepts of how COBIT could be used. So by now, you've already got to know that there will be questions on what are the benefits of COBIT, or why COBIT should be used in enterprises. Now, there are different types of framework. You're not supposed to name of each of these frameworks, but you need to remember that each of this framework has got a particular breadth, and it has also got a particular depth. Which means at a macro level, they'll cover a particular area. For example, COSO is the framework for enterprise risk management across the enterprise. COBIT, under that, is a framework for governance of enterprise information technology. So under COBIT, you may also have ISO 27001, which is a framework for information security, or ISMS, Information Security Management System. So it's important you should know what does each of these frameworks cover and how this can be integrated. Now, if you see, this slide covers, gives you the fascination. For example, you've got this ISO 38000, which is a governance framework, which is issued by ISO pertaining to information technology. So at a macro level, it covers most of the concepts pertaining to governance. But in terms of depth, you find it doesn't really get into the details of management. It focuses only primarily from the point of what this governance is all about. You also have ISO 31000, which is the risk management framework. Now, if you see the risk management framework, the breadth is very low, but the depth is to some extent covers areas. You also have TOGAF framework, which is a governance framework for information architecture. You have another framework, which is ISO 27000, which deals with information security management system. Now, if you look at this, Information system management covers to some extent some areas pertaining to governance. It has a lot of coverage pertaining to align, plan, organize. It has most of the coverage pertaining to build, acquire, and implement. But look at the breadth is very, very minimal. But the depth is quite high. But ISMS doesn't get into deliver service and support. It doesn't cover monitor, evaluate, and assess. So when you want to implement information security, you can use COBIT as a macro framework, or you can use right at the top COSO. Under that you can use COBIT. Under that you can use the information security management system. If you want to learn what is ISMS, there is a 1-week course on ISMS. As a CA student, you're not supposed to know what are the detailed content of ISMS. Just know for each of the frameworks what is the purpose and what is the perspective and how they can be linked together. At a macro level, you also have ITIL, which is also a service management framework, which means when you want to provide services, IT services, we will use ITIL. Now you find the focus of ITIL is mostly on deliver service and support, build, acquire, and implement. You also have PRINCE, which is a project management framework. And then you also have CMI, which is a capability maturity management framework. So based on this, now you should have got a clarity that you can integrate COBIT with various other frameworks. What is important for you is to understand what is the breadth in terms of the detail, and also what are the depth to which the details are covered. Now let's look at the components of COBIT. COBIT is a framework, which means you organize the IT governance objectives and the good practices. It has got process descriptions. What is the process reference model? We'll look at it a little later. So you should remember there is something called a process orientation which is built in, and this is a modular in approach. What is meant by module? Which means if you understand one process, how it is presented and structured, you find all the 38 processes will follow in the same structured approach. There is a common language. COBIT doesn't teach you rocket science. It tells you basic concepts pertaining to management of information technology and governance of information technology. So it means it can be understood by everyone in the organization, whether the person is in the IT audit department, whether the person is in the IT department, or whether it is in any of the functional department, or whether the person is a part of the senior management or board of directors. So everybody can understand and relate to the contents of what is given in COBIT. There are control objectives which are given earlier. Now they're called as management practices or governance practices. This gives you a high-level requirements. You remember we said COBIT can also be used as a benchmark. It means at a macro level, it tells you if you're implementing a particular process, what are the most important things you need to have in terms of the controls, in terms of management practices. And this can be used by the management for effective control for each of the IT processes. So you also have management guidelines, which helps assign the responsibilities, the agreed on objectives, also helps you measuring the performance, and provide the relationship between the other processes. You have the maturity models also, which can be used for assessing the maturity and the capability. These are the different components of COBIT. Now let's look at what are the benefits of COBIT once again. We already see this earlier. There's the increased value creation, user satisfaction, reduce IT-related risk, and you can focus on IT solutions which meet the needs of the business. And IT-related activities are not looked at in isolation, but they're looked at in totality with a holistic approach, which means you do not have islands of information systems implemented across different departments, but you have one integrated information system which is implemented, and each of the departments who need to access this, they accept this common information. So there's a lot of redundancy which can be removed. Similarly, the practices which you need to have related to people, process, and technology are integrated and holistically adopted across the enterprise. And they say it's also a better standard compared to the ISO standards. This gives you some more of benefits of COBIT. It helps enterprise to achieve their objectives, especially from the perspective of governance and management. It helps you in creating the optimal value. It helps you in managing the IT-related risks. And it helps in developing the clear policies and good practices. And you ensure the compliance with the relevant laws and regulations. So you find we're repeating what are the benefits of COBIT here in a different way. Now let's understand how do you customize COBIT as per the enterprise requirements. So you need to remember the most important aspect in COBIT is you need to tailor as per the enterprise specific objectives. So how do you tailor? It has to be based on the business model which is being used. For example, let's say Flipkart can use this one as an e-commerce store, or even Uber can use the Flipkart, or even Yo can use this particular COBIT. So because the COBIT best practice which are given are generic in nature, or a new UPI payment bank which is coming in can also use. So it means it focuses on the business model. Based on the business model, you'll adopt the best practices that are required. Now, regardless of the technology environment which they are using, you can use COBIT. But what you need to do is you need to tailor it as per the enterprise requirements. You can use it across multiple industry, across multiple locations, and also regardless of the corporate culture of the enterprise. So it can be applied to meet the needs for information security or risk management, governance management, assurance activities. So if you see from the point of implementation, COBIT can be used for multiple purposes. And as required, depending on the need, you can implement for implementing security, or for risk management, or for governance management, and also for assurance. So we'll be discussing in the last part of this presentation, part 5, about how COBIT can be used for IS assurance also. And you can also ensure the regulatory requirements of PET, which means you can use COBIT for the purpose of implementing corporate governance, and ERM, which is the requirement as per the corporate governance requirements. And you can use it for financial processing and CSR reporting. Now let's get into a little more details of what COBIT is all about. Do you need to know these principles? If you know the principles of COBIT, it helps you understand how governance is actually done. It provides you more clarity on the principles of governance and management, which we are covering in detail in chapter 1. So what are the 5 principles of COBIT 5? Let's have a quick overview. First, whatever content is given in COBIT, the first principle in which it was built was you need to meet the stakeholder needs, which means first of all, before implementing information technology, ask what do the stakeholder needs, who are the stakeholders, what are their requirements, and then you ensure that the stakeholder needs whatever is required. When you implement COBIT, you cover the enterprise end to end and not in isolation or in islands. Next, you apply a single integrated framework across the enterprise so that there is a homogeneity, a standard structured approach which is used across the enterprise. It also provides you a holistic approach. What is the holistic approach? Holistic approach is based on the 7 enablers. What are the seven enablers? We'll come to this a little later in the second part, in the next part of the presentation as we go on. And you can separate governance from management. Now, this is an important distinction we need to make, that governance and management are different. So we already seen, if you remember in the earlier slide, governance is what is done by the management. Now, if you look at this separation, what is governance, what is management? And this is IT management, which means it's bottom up, whereas governance is top down. So the governance is focused on making things happen, setting the environment. Management is all about making things happen as per directions given by the governance. So let's get into the details of what are each of these principles. Stakeholder needs. What does stakeholder needs mean? So these are some of the concepts that enterprise exists to create value for stakeholders. COBIT provides you all the processes and the other enablers which are required to support business value creation. So which means an enterprise should be able to create business value. COBIT gives you the processes which are required to create the business value. You also have a goals cascade which is given in COBIT, which helps you in translating the stakeholder needs. For example, the stakeholder has enterprise goals. Based on the enterprise goals, you need to formulate the IT related goals. Based on the IT goals which have to be achieved, you decide what are the IT processes we need to be implemented. Now let's go to the second principle. We're talking about covering the enterprise end to end. COBIT helps you in integrating GEIT into the enterprise governance. It covers all the functions and the processes with the enterprise, and it doesn't focus only on the IT. It considers all IT related governance management to be enterprise wide, which means when you're implementing any principles, you're not implementing in any particular department, but you're implementing end to end across the enterprise. Now let's look at the structure, how COBIT helps you in meeting the stakeholder requirements, especially the enterprise end to end. Now, if you look at any organization, now you have the owners and the stakeholders who started the enterprise. They set up a governance body, and then the governance body in turn will have the management, and the management will also set up the operations and execution. So the owner stakeholders, let's say you have Azim Premji, who is a stakeholder, who decides to start a new business. So he set up the board of directors, he formulates a company, he sets a board of directors and delegates the responsibility of making the things happen by achieving the objectives which are set for the enterprise through the governing body. The governing body in turn sets direction to the management as to what they have to achieve. For example, let's say that the payment bank which is started by one of the finance companies, the stakeholder, the owner who is there, will decide what is that they have to start and then formulate the company, set the governing body. The governing body will set the direction and say, in this particular payment bank, and this is the business we're going to do, this is the strategy we're going to adopt, and this is the turnover we need to have, and this is the profit we're going to achieve. So they set up the organizational structure which is required for achieving the business goals. And the management in turn will actually put in instruction, operations and execution. If you look at the reverse way, the operation execution, the implementation team will actually report to the management, and based on it will be monitored. The performance by the management will be monitored by the governing body, and the governing body is held accountable by the owners and stakeholders. This is a process which ensures that the COBIT principles are built on the principle of end-to-end, which means you start right from the top, right from the owners and stakeholders, and you look at right at the bottom of the organization, and the mechanism and process which helps you to achieve the business objectives across the enterprise, end-to-end. Now, if you look at the same concept in terms of the scope and responsibility, you have the governance body which has said this. The governance body has got these objectives: benefit realization, or risk optimization, or resource optimization. These are the three governance objectives. And fundamentally, we're looking at value creation. Now, there are certain governance enablers, governance scope, based on which you decide the roles, activities, and relationship, which you have seen a little earlier in the earlier slide. Now, let's look at the third principle, which is a single integrated framework. How is it a single aligned framework? Because it helps you align with the relevant and the latest standards and frameworks. We have seen how COBIT can be integrated earlier. It's complete in the enterprise coverage, which means it provides a basis to integrate with other frameworks, standards, and practices. Now let's look at the next one, the holistic approach. This is the most important aspect of COBIT. So we'll look at the 7 dimensions or 7 enablers. So COBIT defines a set of enablers, and these are 7 enablers. We'll see shortly what are the 7 enablers and how these are linked together. And it also provides a comprehensive governance and management system for enterprise IT. What is enabler? Enabler is anything that can help the organization achieve the objectives. For example, you're using information technology to achieve the business objectives. That's an enabler. You have people, process, and system in place. That's an enabler. You've got information which is required for the organization. That's an enabler. You've got process in place. That's an enabler. So we'll see what are the different types of enablers and how this is linked together in the next part. Now, when you say enabler, enabling a holistic approach, let's understand the structure of how content is provided in COBIT. There is a process. We said there are totally 38 processes. For each processes, you have a set of organized practices and activities. You also have a mechanism, which is the organized structure, which is given. And then you have the culture, ethics, and behavior. Then you have principle, policy, and framework. And information, which is said is the currency of the 21st century, which is enabled through COBIT in terms of effective usage. Then you have services, infrastructure, and applications. And then you have people, skills, and competencies. So if you look at enterprise, now and look at the relationship between these 7 enablers which are given here, let's understand. Let's go back and let's have quick clarity. So these are the 7 enablers. I'm just thought we'll cover this a little more detail because you may have questions on this. What are the 7 enablers and how these are linked together? Let's start from the middle. Any organization needs to have principles, policies, and frameworks. That becomes the starting point. Now, these principles, policies, and frameworks need to be managed through various resources. So you have the 3 information resources, 3 resources, which is information, services, infrastructure, and applications, and we have people, skills, and competencies. These are the resources which are there in any organization. Now, you also have people, skills, and competencies which need to be driven based on the needs of the organization. So this is where the culture, ethics, and behavior comes in. These people need to be organized in a structured way. That's where you have the organized structure. And these people have to perform certain processes which is organized through technology. This is where you have the processes. So you can call these as the last 3 as the resources. The first 3 are the intangible resources. So these are the 7 enablers. Now let's look at this 5th principle, which is separating governance from management. Now this is the key. Governance is the responsibility of the board of directors, and this is under the leadership of the chairperson or the chairman as applies. You evaluate the stakeholder needs, determine what are the agreed objectives for the enterprise, and set direction. Now remember I talked about governance as direction and control, and you monitor the performance and compliance. Management is all about the responsibility which is under the leadership of the CEO, and they focus on PBRM, which is plan, build, run, and monitor. And this is based on the goals set by the governance. You also perform activities, various types of activities, in alignment with the direction set by the management. For example, the governance said that we are getting into e-commerce and we want to achieve a turnover of so and so. Based on the management, we formulate the detailed policies, procedures, activities, resources, etc., to ensure that the organization is run in the direction to achieve the business objectives as set by the governance body. Now let's understand what is this COBIT process reference model. So COBIT says there are processes which are governance oriented and there are management oriented. It represents all of these processes normally found in any enterprise for all activities. That's why COBIT is called as a framework which is generic in nature. It doesn't have any controls which are specific to, let's say, a banking industry, or specific to an outsourcing industry, or specific to, let's say, the IT industry. All the practices of the process which are given in COBIT are generic in nature. A little later, we'll see some example of what are the different processes are there. It also provides you a framework for measuring and monitoring IT. Now, this gives you the overall perspective of the COBIT process reference model. At the top, you have the stakeholder needs, so define what are the business needs. And then you have governance, and governance consists of, if you remember, we have repeated so many times, EDM. And management is all about PBRM, plan, build, run, and monitor. And these are the 4 dimensions. Sorry, these are not 4 dimensions. These are the 4 domains of management, and this is the one domain which is pertaining to governance. So there are totally, as I said, there are 5 processes here, and there are about 33. So totally you got 38. Now let's go to the 7 enablers which I discussed earlier. So you have the principles, policies, and framework, which is the heart, and these are the resources we talked about. The information is the resource for the organization. This information is generated using information technology infrastructure. We use various types of services, and we use various types of application. And these are performed by people who have got the required skills and competencies. Now, these people's skills and competencies have to be deployed as per the corporate governance structure, as per the principles, ethical behavior, etc. And this is where you have the concept of culture, ethics, and behavior. Now, when you organize the people, they have to be done in a systematically as per a particular structure. That's where you organize structure. And this information which has to be processed has to be based on specific set of business processes which are standardized across the enterprise. Now, these are the 7 building blocks, or the 7 enablers of COBIT. There are also 4 dimensions. So you have this SGLG, which is stakeholder goals, and you have life cycle, and then you also have goals or good practices. Okay, so when you're implementing COBIT, you find that COBIT actually helps in ensuring that you're able to identify who are the stakeholders. These stakeholders could be internal or external. You are also able to set goals which are pertaining to the context, the relevance, quality. It could be pertaining to access, security, etc. And you also have a life cycle approach which is followed, which means you plan, design, build, implement. You also use, operate, evaluate, monitor, etc. And there are good practices which can be used in terms of best practices, and there are also work products and formats or templates for documentation. Now, this gives you a snapshot of what COBIT process is all about. You may not get a detailed question on all this process. For example, you may not be asked what is BA14 or what is DSS4. Okay, you don't need to remember this. Just understand this from an architect perspective, that COBIT has one governance domain. COBIT has got 4 management domains. Okay, and these are the different processes which are there. So you have the 5 processes which starts with establish or ensure governance framework setting and maintenance, ensure the benefit delivery, and then ensure risk optimization, resource optimization, and stakeholder transparency. These are the 5 governance processes. And then you have the 4 management domains. It starts with align, plan, organize, build, acquire, and implement, deliver service and support, and the last one is pertaining to monitor, evaluate, and assess. So I just wanted you to get an idea about how this process is structured. You may not get into the details For example, there is a 2-day course or 3-day course talking about different processes where you get into the nitty-gritties. So when you're using COBIT, what is important to understand is select the process which is relevant for the organization. For example, that organization, they found they have to improve risk management. So then they may select manage risk. They may also select from the governance domain, manage risk optimization, and they'll start implementing the best practices from this process as required. For example, an enterprise wants to implement COBIT for business continuity management. So in that case, what are the processes they'll select? Just look at the titles, you'll be able to know. When you're doing risk management, you know that you have to select manage risk. You also need to select a process pertaining to manage continuity. In addition to that, you'll also pick up process pertaining to business process controls which are there. You'll also have to manage service requests and incidents. You'll also look at manage operations. You need to manage the assets. So like that, you'll identify which are the processes. You also look at the service agreements. So you'll pick up specific process, then get into the detailed content of what is given in COBIT in terms of the processes. And in the process, you'll look at the practices which are given. From the management practices, you'll go and pick up the content as required, as applicable. You'll customize it, and that becomes the benchmark we use for the purpose of evaluation. Now let's look at risk management. What is risk management? We already covered this in detail. So it is nothing but a set of processes which the management identifies, analyzes, and where necessary, they respond appropriately to the risks that might adversely affect the business objectives. So if you remember, we discussed risk management is all about ensuring that the risks are managed, which means you look at potential events which can prevent you from achieving the objectives and focus on responding to them to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. The response to the risk typically depends on the perceived gravity, the impact, the severity. It also involves controlling, avoiding, accepting, or transferring them. So this, we have discussed this as a part of the risk management strategy. And organizations have to routinely manage a wide range of risks. What are the different types of risks? The risk could be pertaining to technology, it could be commercial, financial, information security, regulatory requirements, etc. Now let's understand how COBIT could be used for GRC. GRC, as you know, is governance, risk, and compliance. What is the governance program or a GRC program implementation require? So first of all, you need to define clearly what GRC requirements are. Identify the regulatory and compliance requirements, because GRC is primarily about governance, risk, and compliance. The focus on compliance and governance. Review currently what process they have and what is the GRC status, and determine what is the best approach to implement the practices. You also need to set out the key parameters which need to be measured, based on which you will ensure whether success is achieved. Use a process-oriented or structured approach, and you can adopt global practices like COBIT. And you can ensure by using this you have a uniform structured approach which is also auditable. You find one of the major audience for using COBIT is the auditors. So can you use COBIT for GRC? What are the benefits of using COBIT for GRC? Now you find one of the important aspects is it helps you in implementing all aspects pertaining to GRC. You also are able to cover all aspects pertaining to governance processes and the related enablers. We have seen what are the 7 enablers. Let's look at what could the metrics to measure the success of GR. So you're able to reduce the redundant controls. You're able to bring in reduction in the control failures. You're able to reduce the expenditure related to legal regulatory requirements. You're able to reduce the overall time required to audit the key business areas because you're following a structured approach and you're adopting the best practices. You may also ensure improvement through streamlining the processes and timely reporting of the regular compliance issues and remediation measures. And you have a dashboard which helps you in identifying what are the key compliance areas, because many organizations which are, let's say, which are financial in nature, if the compliance is not done, you find they are imposed a heavy penalty. Now that gives you a complete overview of what COBIT is all about. I'll give a quick recap at the end when I come to the end of this presentation. Now let's look at one example how COBIT can be used for IT compliance review. Now here when I say compliance, which means we're talking about comply, which means there are certain regulatory requirements, there are certain contractual requirements which need to be complied with. If you don't comply, there are going to be penalties and fines. What is meant by IT compliance review? Let's say we have GRC. So there are regulations which are there. For example, in the US, you got the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which has these 2 sections, 302 and 404, which we discussed briefly in first part of the presentation. We when we talk about governance and management. Similarly, in India, we also have the Clause 49 listing agreement, and recently we have the IFC, which is an expansion of the SOX or the Clause 49 requirement. You also have Information Technology Act, especially which was amended in 2008, which also talks about various types of computer crimes which are there. It also talks about privacy, which is protection of sensitive personal data information, which is captured in an organization. Now, information technology, many enterprises are not aware, is applicable for most of the enterprises which collect personal information. For example, you register an online store and provide your personal information. That personal information has to be protected. The responsibility for protecting this personal information is of the organization. If they don't provide the right security for this information, and this information is leaked, then the organization can be sued. For example, let's say you go to a medical diagnostic lab, you do a diagnostic for you for a certain ailment, and you got a report. Now, the medical diagnostic agency which has done this diagnostic should ensure that this particular report which comes in pertaining to your ailment has to be secured, which means it's private to you. This cannot be shared with any enterprise, and this is mandated by law. Not only that, the information technology also covers various types of cyber crimes. You also have the Indian Companies Act, which talks about GRC requirements. What are the GRC requirements? You have the corporate governance requirements, which also require the enterprise risk management. This also requires that you have the internal controls, which are supposed to be implemented. And in the case of IT, we know it's all about internal controls which are embedded inside IT. So this is where you need to have the GEIT also. And you also have the company's order, CARO report, which is applicable. Now let's start with compliance. So what does compliance would mean? That you need to conform with the stated requirements, which are regulatory in nature, and these are applied across the organization through specific management processes. You need to identify what are the applicable requirements, for example, which are defined in law, regulations, contract strategy. For example, let's say you are registered under VAT, so what are sales are there? As per the VAT regulations, you need to ensure that these are billed, accounted, and you pay the tax for this as required. You can also take the input credit for the purchase made. Similarly, if you're making any payments as per the Income Tax Act, you need to deduct TDS. So there are various regulatory requirements which have to be taken care of. You need to assess currently what is the state of compliance. Now these regulatory requirements, most of these regulatory requirements could be embedded inside information technology, which means you look at information technology, there are various types of application software which are being used, and this application software may have or must have the controls which are related to the regulatory environment or the regulatory requirements. You assess the risk and the potential cost of non-compliance. For example, bank is supposed to comply with the RBI regulations or as per the Banking Regulation Act. Not only that, it also is supposed to abide by the rules of various regulatory agencies. If it doesn't abide by this particular rule, there are penalties and fines which can be imposed on the company. So the company has to evaluate and make a list of all the type of compliance which are applicable to the company, ensure that they have process in place to measure these are actually met as per the requirements. So you need to have a structured approach or a process. So when you use COBIT, you're able to implement and adopt the best practice to ensure conformance with the regulatory requirements. Shortly, we'll see with some examples. So you can also decide what are the corrective action to be taken as required. Now let's look at COBIT. COBIT has a specific process called MEA03, which talks about monitor, evaluate, and assess compliance with the external requirement. So it only says that you need to assess, which means the enterprise has to assess what are the external requirements which are applicable. COBIT doesn't give you, let's say for a banking industry, what are the regulatory requirements. COBIT tells you for every organization, they need to have a process whereby they know clearly what are the compliance they have to adhere to as per the external requirements. It also helps you in evaluating whether the IT process and IT support business process are compliant with the law, regulations, and the contractual requirement. For example, an e-commerce store which is set up by a company from the US, if it's operating in India, it has to adhere to all the regulatory requirements or the regulatory contracts as applicable for Indian companies. For example, let's say we're making a sale, the VAT is applicable. Similarly, if it's making certain payments, TDS is applicable. If making certain services, the service tax is applicable. So all the regulatory compliance which are applicable to any enterprise have to be applied to that particular enterprise also. So you need to make a list and then accordingly ensure compliance. You need to ensure that the IT compliance are integrated overall with the enterprise compliance. For example, it's a Companies Act. As per the Companies Act, the company has to file certain reports. As per the Companies Act, the company has to have ERM. So you need to integrate compliance not as a separate, as an integral part of the business process of the enterprise process. Now let's look at how COBIT is actually gives you details pertaining to compliances. You have set of enterprise activities that are designed to ensure compliance, which means, let's say, any payment which is being made, the employees or the application software is actually processing this payment has inbuilt rules pertaining to the TDS so that the company complies with TDS. Similarly, any payment made for, let's say, for service tax, the company, the software which is being used has inbuilt the compliance requirements pertaining to service tax. Then you also have externally imposed legislative regulatory requirements which also need to be considered. Then you have the RACI chart. The RACI chart, if you remember, we talked about responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. So you have a set of organization structure, for example, the CEO, CFO, CMO, CIO, and the head of IT, etc. For each of the head of the departments, so you also have what are the enterprise roles for each process. For example, in the business continuity process, for each of the business process areas, business continuity process areas, what are the specific designations, how are they going to be involved, and what is the responsibility pertaining to compliance has to be specifically brought out. So we discussed this. Yeah, these are the processes which are there. Now let's look at the description. What does the process say? Evaluate that IT process and IT support business process are compliant with law, regulation, and contractual requirements. You also need to obtain assurance that the requirements have been identified and complied with. Not only that, these are integrated with the IT compliance needs of the overall enterprise compliance. This is a process description which tells you what does the COBIT process MEA03 mean. You also have a process purpose statement which tells you by implementing this particular process, what is achieved. What is the purpose of implementing this specific management process? You also have certain aspects where you're talking about legal and regulatory requirements is a key part of the effective governance. Hence, you need to ensure that these are met by implementing GRC, and COBIT is the framework which can help you in implementing this. In addition to MA3, we also have various types of enterprise activities to be performed, and you need to have control activities which are designed to ensure compliance, which means in each of the business process areas, wherever applicable, you need to ensure compliance. And this is done by implementing principles, policies, and procedures as applicable across the enterprise. Let's look at some examples of key management practices of IT compliance. You identify specific compliance requirements. You optimize the responses to the external requirements. You confirm the external compliance, and then you obtain assurance on the external compliances. These are the key management practices which have to be followed by an enterprise. Let's look at how do you measure compliance by assessing whether the compliance is being done well within the company. So you look at the cost pertaining to non-compliance, whether it's been increasing or decreasing, and you can set metrics pertaining to that. For example, last year so much money was spent on penalties and fines, and this year our objective is to reduce it to this extent, or by 20% or 25%. You also look at measuring the number of IT-related non-compliance issues which are reported to the board, and you decide that you're going to reduce it to a particular percentage, or eliminate it, or minimize. You also look at the number of non-compliance issues related to contractual agreements with IT providers and how many of them have been complied last year, how many were non-compliances, and again this year, what are the goals which are set for this. You look at coverage of the compliance assessment, how many compliance were there, how whether this have been assessed. These are some of the metrics which can be set for measuring and monitoring the compliances are implemented within the organization. You also are compliant with the internal policies, and these are some of the examples. You look at the number of incidents related to non-compliance, percentage stakeholders who understand the policies. You look at the percentage of policies which are supported by effective standards and working practices, and the frequency of the policies, reviews, and updates. So if you see, compliance is not only internal, but they can be external also. In fact, they're actually, most of these are, which are radical or which are external, and you also need to have internal compliances. Now let's look at some of the questions which can come pertaining to this topic. Now, COBIT is a vast subject, So there are 1 week course which are done to cover various aspects of COBIT. So from a CA student perspective, you're supposed to have a generic understanding of COBIT in terms of the concepts you discussed. I'll give you a quick recap at the end of this presentation. So now let's look at the type of questions we can have. Explain how to use COBIT framework as a tool for implementing governance or enterprise IT. Now understand the context. Here we are talking about how the COBIT could be used as a tool for implementing governance. So what are the key principles we talked about? You need to select specific processes applicable and you need to customize them as applicable so that you are able to derive the business value. Now this is a generic principle which has to be adopted. Let's go further. Explain briefly the key elements of an IT governance framework. I'm sure you got an answer. What are the key elements of IT governance? List the 5 IT governance stakeholders and explain the role. So you have the different stakeholders who could be there. We said there are external stakeholders, there are internal stakeholders. You need to understand who are the external stakeholders. For example, the external stakeholders could be the regulatory agencies, could be the lenders or investors. The internal stakeholders could be the management, could be the employees, could be the customers. Customers are actually the external stakeholders. Suppliers are also the external stakeholders. What are the key benefits of implementing IT governance? So quite often in most of the frameworks, you're talking about what are the benefits, which means you should know clearly what are the advantages of implementing a framework like COBIT. Explain the 5 principles of COBIT. I hope you remember what is that we talked about. So first of all, any enterprise, if you see, first you need to look at enterprise got business objectives. So it means there are stakeholder needs. Next, the principle is pertaining to enterprise end-to-end. So when you're implementing, you want to ensure that this end-to-end. So use a single integrated framework. And the 4th one is you adopt a holistic approach. And the 5th one is you separate governance from management. You also see quite often there are questions pertaining to this, where they say, explain briefly the 5 principles of COBIT. Now, depending on the number of marks, whether it's 4 marks or 8 marks, you need to expand the details. But most of the cases, remember, you have to know what are the 5 principles. Then you also have the 7 enablers of COBIT 5. What are the 7 enablers of COBIT 5? If you remember, we talked about the core is the principles, policies, and framework. This is what is required. And you need to have, enterprise needs to have information, which is one of the most valuable resources. This information is generated using services, infrastructure, and applications, software. And this has to be managed by people, and the people need to have the appropriate skills and competence, people skills and competencies. Now, these people skills and competencies have to be operate as per the culture, ethics, and behavior. Now, you need to organize people as per a particular organized structure, and these people will be running specific business processes. Okay, this gives you the 7 enablers of COBIT. Now, you find it becomes very easy to remember when you internalize and you're able to see the linkage or the relationship between each of the 7 enablers. The last question here is about describe how COBIT can be used for implementing governance, risk, and compliance. And this is what we have briefly discussed. GRC is all about ensuring that you are able to understand what are the governance, risk management, and compliance requirements of the enterprise, and you need to implement it as per the needs of the organization. I hope this presentation has given a quick overview, understanding of what COBIT is all about. Now, this might be a little dense, so what I suggest is that you need to come back to this presentation multiple times till you understand. Understand not only from a theoretical perspective to remember, but understand so that you can actually implement. Let's have a quick recap of what we have discussed. This is very critical because you need to understand COBIT, because COBIT is important not only from the examination perspective, but also from a practical perspective. What we have provided you in this presentation is a gist of what COBIT is all about, is the essence of what COBIT is all about. We have discussed 2 topics in this presentation. One is how COBIT is a GEIT framework or a business framework which can be used. And then we discussed about how IT compliance review can be done using COBIT. As far as the COBIT is concerned, we first had a quick walkthrough why enterprise need to use COBIT, what are the benefits which accrue to COBIT, how COBIT as a macro framework or an umbrella framework can be integrated with various other frameworks. We also saw the different components of COBIT in terms of the elements. We can also look at the benefits of COBIT and how you can customize COBIT as per the requirements. I said COBIT is more like a 5-star menu. So you need to, when you go for a buffet, you need to decide what you want to pick and choose. So in using COBIT, it's important that you select what is required in terms of specific processes and customize these practices which are given as per the needs of the COBIT, because COBIT is generic in nature. There are 5 principles of COBIT. If you remember the 5 principles we talked about, talked about meeting the stakeholder needs, and then we had enterprise end-to-end using a single integrated framework, and then we have the 4th principle, which is about using a holistic approach, which also had the 7 enablers, and we had the 5th one, which is separating governance from management. Now, it's important that you note these principles and remember, because most of the case I've been saying you need to understand, but there are certain concepts you should also remember. These 5 principles and 7 enablers are something we should remember. Now, we also talked about the COBIT process reference model, where I said whatever is provided in COBIT is provided in a structured way, is presented in a particular architectural way. You need to understand how this information is actually architected. COBIT is all about processes. There are totally 5 domains. We already discussed the domains. We have the governance domain, and then we have the management domain, which talks about PBRM, which is plan, build, run, and monitor. And you have under each of them certain processes. Under each of the processes, there are management practices. And we talked about the 7 enablers of COBIT. Now, if you remember the 7 enablers, we said you need to start with the principles, policies, and framework. The principles and policies framework are required to ensure that you're able to use the information as a key resource of the organization. To use the information, you need to have the services, infrastructure, and the application software. And these are used by the people who need to have the required competencies and skill sets. Now, these are the 3 resources. Now, these people, skills, and competencies have to be organized, have to be driven based on the culture, ethics, and behavior. The people also have to be organized as per the organized structure, and you need to have processes in place. And these are the intangible resources, which are the 7 enablers. So put together, you have all the 7 enablers, which are all linked together. You can also do risk management in COBIT, which we have discussed in detail, that there are various aspects pertaining to risk which are covered in COBIT, and this could be pertaining to how you can implement COBIT from the risk management point of view. So you have the governance domain, which has the process pertaining to risk optimization. There is a specific process pertaining to managing the risk in the COBIT domain. In addition to that, for each of the management practices, you can look at the organization best practices and look at what can go wrong in that process. Use the management practices to mitigate the risks. We also saw an example of how COBIT best practices can be used for implementing GRC. COBIT is used with the framework of GEIT, which means you can use it for the purpose of ensuring corporate governance. This in summary is COBIT. Now let's look at IT compliance review. COBIT gives you the compliance principles pertaining to COBIT. This is actually COBIT 5, not COBIT 52. So you have COBIT 5, where it gives you specific things pertaining to compliances. You have the specific process which is given in the MEA domain, monitor, evaluate, and assess domain. You also have management practices which are given for this domain, which talks about when an enterprise has to ensure compliance, one of the most important things they have to do is they have to identify what are the regulatory requirements, what are the compliance requirements. These regulatory requirements could be pertaining to the external regulatory requirements. This could also be pertaining to the internal regulatory requirements or contractual requirements. So you have management practices which help you in identifying, managing, and measuring this. You also have metrics which help you in ensuring that you know what are the compliances, you measure these compliances so that you are able to implement this, because not implementing or non-compliance will result in penalties and fines. It may also impact the service deliverables to the various customers. So it's important that an enterprise understands what are the different types of compliance which are applicable to the company. In short, if you have to remember this particular aspect of the chapter, you need to remember there are 2 things we talked about. COBIT is all about governance, and in governance we talked about GEIT. Now the best way to remember this topic is to ask the 6 questions. Now you should, after listening to this lecture, you should be able to answer the 6 questions. What are the 6 questions? What is COBIT? Why do you need COBIT? How do you implement COBIT? Now who requires COBIT? When is COBIT required? And where can COBIT be used? Now if you're able to answer this question, I think you have made a good use of this presentation, Otherwise, I suggest you go back to the presentation, look at and see whether you can answer these questions. Most of the questions in the exam pertaining to this topic are in this particular area. For example, why? You might ask about what are the benefits of COBIT. This is what you will get. What is COBIT? Why is it a business framework? How is COBIT implemented? This tells you how is COBIT to be architected. Who requires COBIT? You look at the various the stakeholders who are there. When is COBIT required? It could be used for GRC or for various types of compliance. Implemented. So when you look at implementation of COBIT, where can be COBIT implemented? You find that COBIT can be implemented any part of the enterprise, which means it can be implemented across the enterprise or it can be implemented in any specific area of enterprise. COBIT can also be used by different stakeholders. They can be used by the management. COBIT can be used by the auditors. They can be used by the regulators. It can also be used by the functional heads or the users. So COBIT is a generic framework which can be used by any of the employees or by the regulators or any of the stakeholders. So what I suggest for understanding this topic, because it's a very critical topic, if you're not able to understand, come back to this topic, because once you get clarity in this topic, you find this will help you to understand this chapter completely. The heart of governance, especially the chapter 1, is COBIT. So if you understand the principles of COBIT, you actually understood what is governance and consensus management is all about. Now, in the ISCA paper, if you look at this one, the first chapter is governance and management of information system. And based on my experience, I found this is supposed to be the toughest chapter. Now, if you understand this chapter in terms of the context, in terms of the concepts, in terms of the practical applicability, you find understanding the other chapters becomes very, very easy. I hope I have made your understanding of COBIT simpler. If not, I suggest you go back to study material, refer, revise, and repeat till you get clarity. So wish you all the best and meet you again in the next presentation.